All right, introducing the author of Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine, as well as the Scott Horton Academy, and co-host of my new favorite show on the internet, Provoked, which airs every Friday night at 8 p.m. Scott Horton, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good, good. So I know the world is in a crazy state right now where tons of things are happening just about every second. So we're going to take a little bit of a step back today and kind of look at some origins, if it were. So I know that you've mentioned in the past that seeing Ron Paul on TV was kind of like a major influence on your political awakening, as it were. What would you say are some of those other experiences or events that kind of help shape your influence and views and things like that?
Well, I don't know, man. I think probably most libertarians would say like we've kind of always been like this for whatever various reasons. I saw a thing the other day that said liberals hate their dads, conservatives or libertarians hate their teachers, their public school teachers. I'm like, that probably actually would explain a lot, just growing up in government school. There's been a lot of influences there. My parents were just barely sort of left of center Democrats, meaning that not that they were ideological in any way, but just I was not raised to revere Ronald Reagan and George Bush in those days when I was growing up. So that was a nice kind of bonus. And then I was even interested in Iran-Contra and stuff like that, even when I was really young, like, 10, 11 years old was when that stuff was coming out. And I don't know how I first learned this, but I knew that Ronald Reagan was a dope pusher and that the whole war on drugs was a giant scam and that the CIA had brought in all that cocaine during the crack epidemic and all of that. They were really the origin of all that. I don't remember how I first learned that, but I knew that when George Bush Sr. was still in power, before Bill Clinton came to power, maybe even still in the Reagan years. It was one of those things I kind of always knew. And I grew up in the shadow of Vietnam, right, where every bum on the side of the road was wearing an olive green army jacket. And they were from that war, and that was what was wrong with them. And there was so much, all the movies of the 1980s, all the Vietnam War movies, and just the popular culture there was very sort of post-church committee kind of, the dominant liberal narrative was anti-establishment because it was the Reagan years. So like, even like that Stephen King movie Firestarter is all like the evil secret CIA MK Ultra program that gave this girl the powers that she has or whatever. It's just kind of the oh God, forgive me, like the zeitgeist of that time or whatever is like had a lot of kind of anti-establishmentarian stuff in it and whatever. And then so let's see, I guess I was exposed to I was for Iraq War One only in the sense that I was 15 and I wanted to see some explosions and I didn't give a damn about the Iraqis, but I'm like a boy with red blood and I want to see some tanks and planes do all the things as advertised, I was born 2 years after Vietnam ended. So like, show me something. They show us all these cool supersonic jets, like show me them do something. But I was suspicious of the politics. And I remember, I learned in government school that only Congress can declare war. And here H.W. Bush says he only needs the UN Security Council and he doesn't even need Congress. And eventually he did go to the Congress, but he originally argued that he didn't need to. And all while he's announcing the New World Order and all of this kind of stuff while he's launching Iraq War One. So, I got some radical politics out of that. And then I first became exposed to like the right wing New World Order type conspiracy stuff around that time. And so there's a book called Behold a Pale Horse, which is crazy conspiracy crap, but it had this really cool chart in the back. It was all the powerful people who are the members of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberg Group, which is basically the Rockefeller institutions of that era, and the way they portrayed it, it was like, this is the real Congress. This is where all the real decisions are made. And then everybody goes out and plays their separate roles or whatever. This is not really right, but hell, close enough. But anyway, it's like, this is the ruling establishment as not usually outlined for regular schmucks to see, kind of thing. And then what was really lucky was, I was very interested in the election of 92, but I was still just a kid, and I definitely was not impressed by Bill Clinton or like believed in him or any of that. Although I did just kind of overall, as an Austinite, want to see the Republicans lose after 12 years, But I went to this really cool private school for high school, and I guess this isn't even where I got it from. That's just how I remember the scene at the time. After Clinton was elected, but before he was sworn in, so it was in January after we came back to school for the second semester, but before January 20th, it would have been just a few days, I guess, before he was inaugurated. I saw an updated chart of all the Council on Foreign Relations members. And there was William Jefferson Clinton at the top of the list. And he was a member not just of the CFR and the TC like George Bush Sr., but of the Bilderberg group too. And so I went, wow, here, I'm in 10th grade or whatever. Wow. So really, he is not the boy from Hope at all, right? He's from Wall Street. He's from New York City, man. And he's connected to the Rockefellers and this kind of ruling establishment that they never explained that on TV, but there's no denying that these are not Little Rock based institutions here that we're talking about. You know what I mean? That is not what's going on here. There's something else going on. And then, right at that time, just, 8 weeks later, he murdered all the Branch Davidians, sent the Delta Force and the FBI to kill all the Branch Davidians. About a year after that, Bill Hicks died. And I had not been exposed to Bill Hicks before that, but immediately after he died, Kevin Booth started putting all of his stuff on the Access Channel. Maybe it had already been on the Access Channel, but they started playing Sane Man all the time. And then very soon after that, Rant and E Minor, they put together the kind of video version of Rant and E Minor that went on the Access Channel that they would play all the time. So I got super into Bill Hicks. I was also really into George Carlin, and in his Jamming in New York was 1 year after the first Iraq War. And he has this whole bit at the beginning about what a damned fool you are to believe in the Iraq War. But then at the end, it's what a damn fool you are if you believe in recycling and Earth Day and driving Volvos and being a good little self-interested liberal prick type, which to me was really beneficial because, being from Austin, Texas, I have all of these left-wing and right-wing influences all over the place that I gotta, as a young man, sift through. And here Carlin is telling me, oh, fuck them. You don't have to believe in any of this stuff at all, right? And then he's clearly the wisest man in society. So you can trust him when he says you don't have to trust them. You'd be a damn fool to believe in them. You know what I mean? So no matter who they are. So from the time I was like in 10th grade or whatever, I was very inoculated before I ever had to choose whether I lean left or right. I knew that I didn't have to lean left or right. And then, so, libertarianism really appealed to me at that time, just because it has the right-wing anti-government sentiment of the Bill Clinton era without all of the right-wing moral crusading. You know what I mean? So I can be like a Bircher hippie of some kind, you know what I mean? And and like in Austin, if you go to the gun show, you will see dudes in tie-dye walking out of there with machine guns that you are not sure are okay. Like, well, I don't know. I hope we don't have plans for that thing. What the hell? So it is, and I had, I had one of my teachers was a right-wing hippie, like a real legitimate, very tough guy on a Harley with a 45 who was a botanist and, very much a hippie in a lot of ways, but also not, like a pinko commie type either. You know what I mean? Like, and also music is important too, right? So when I was in junior high, like all heavy metal was anti-war stuff. And like, Master of Puppets it's not about Vietnam. It's about the world wars. Right. And so like if the world wars are evil and corrupt and you can't believe even in fighting in the Second World War, then forget everything else. Right. Sort of like my book about Afghanistan. Well, shit, if you can't get behind the Afghan war, then how do you stand behind Iraq or Libya or Syria or anything else that came after it? Mm-hmm. When at least bin Laden was there when the war started. Right? You know what I mean? At least he had a pretext for that one. This is the same kind of thing there. Back to the front, Disposable Heroes, first song on the second side of Master of Puppets is about the extremely low value that the officer corps puts on the life of an enlisted man. And, you know, I don't know about you, but like for me, the music I was rocking in junior high is the stuff that was most important. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It like influences everything that comes, you know.
Yeah, and I'm a skater, so you know there was a lot of Public Enemy around, and a lot of like metal and hardcore, you know, suicidal tendencies and all that kind of, you know, spirit of stuff, Body Count and whatever. Remember Ice-T's?
Oh, the Ice-T group, yeah, 1992, I think. Yeah.
So and I love Public Enemy. They're my number 2 after Beastie Boys, and so there's a lot of, you know, you might even call them right-wing anti-government sentiments in there because they had a lot of Nation of Islam influences. So even though there's a lot of left-wing influence there's a lot of kind of right-wing influence in their messaging and whatever too. So like their second album especially is like very punk rock and very anti-government. You know, a lot of very Nation of Millions.
Yeah.
Lots of like very anti-national government slogans in there and that kind of thing. You know, so that was also a very huge influence on me at the time. And then what was I going to say about 94 before I get to I remember before I get to Ron Paul was in 94, they announced that W. Bush was running for governor, and Jeb Bush had already announced he was running in Florida. And I still remember, you know, where I was, time and place. And I explained to my math teacher, oh, you see what's going on here. They're running both Bush sons for governor, so that guaranteed one of them at least will be in his second term so he can run for president in the year 2000. And then we're going back to Iraq. And because it was just, and I hadn't even heard Bill Kristol say this. When I heard Bill Kristol say this later, I was like, see how they do. And I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what a neocon was at the time, but I remember thinking, yeah, this is the narrative, is that there's this terrible shame. Bill Hicks made fun of H.W. Bush in this same way, had a whole bit about this, about the shame of Bush Sr. being unelected after one term with Saddam Hussein still in the chair over there, and how this was something that had to be, you know, compensated for, whatever. And then, so in my math class conspiracy, immediately I said, so that means they're going to have to throw the election of 96 and make sure that Bill Clinton wins again so that they can run fresh, a Bush fresh in 2000. And which is, of course, exactly what happened. They nominated a crippled old man, you know, Bob Dole, who absolutely should have been made to stand aside for a better candidate and did not, you know, which I took to me as like total confirmation of like, see, the skull and bones rules everything or whatever, you know? And then, so Ron Paul came back to Congress in 97. And this is one of the ways I really knew that I liked the John Birchers, was because even though they were very far to the right of me on a lot of things, they love Ron Paul, and for good reasons too. And, you know, the guy who was the editor of the New American Magazine then, ended up becoming my very good friend and later the co-founder of the Libertarian Institute with me, William Norman Grigg, the great William Norman Grigg. And so I really learned a lot from them. And at the time, I did not know about LouRockwell.com, the Mises Institute. Antiwar.com at that time was only brand new, but I didn't really even know about, say, call it like the Mises Institute side of the movement. That I later became very closely associated with. As far as I understood, you know, from the Austin Access channel and various people that I met around and whatever, I understood libertarianism to basically be, you know, like, oh, look at us, we're skeptics. We're so rational, we're skeptical. But what are you skeptical of? You're skeptical that it's really true that the sanctions are starving a bunch of Iraqi babies to death? Or you're really skeptical that Jesus's mother was a virgin? Or you're right, like, isn't that so like avant-garde or whatever to like question whether Protestant Christianity is really 100% legit when you're like a 7th grader? That's like a really brave stand to take or whatever. Or they would say, you know, oh, the Gulf War illness is obviously being embellished. I'm like, really? Because people are dying of it, and we know we have like a laundry list of causes, including the obvious, like burning oil wells and anti-sarin pills and untested anthrax vaccines and all kinds of things that obviously were really hurting these guys who fought in Iraq War I. And then the libertarians, I'm picking on really Matt Welch at Reason Magazine, quite frankly, here. Oh, when I'm so skeptical and rational that I'm not sure if I believe all this anti-government stuff that people are passing around right now. So to me, libertarianism seemed just so like limp-wristed and weak. And meanwhile, all my right-wing militia friends they care about the Branch Davidians. They care about Gulf War illness. They care even about the sanctions regime against them poor, helpless Arab Iraqis. Because what did they ever do to us? And these are right wingers too, but they just don't believe in the program, man. And I prefer that spirit, even if combined with social policies that I don't necessarily align with, because I just don't even give a crap about that kind of stuff. I'm much more interested in America's relationship with the rest of the world and what that means for the American people, you know? And then, as I was saying, so then Ron Paul came to power, back to power, to office in District 14 down there, representing the Texas Gulf Coast in 97. And I had heard him on the radio in 96, but it was like some weird little thing and I didn't understand what was going on. But then the first time I ever saw him on TV, it was really like right around 10 years to the day or so, 10 years to the week or 10 years to the month, before the big Giuliani moment where everybody else got clued into the brilliance of Ron Paul in May of 2007. But it would have been right around late spring of 1997 that, or maybe a little earlier. But I saw Ron Paul on, and I later found this, by the way, when he was running for president, I found this in the archives and linked to it. I'm sure the link's dead and gone now, but I did end up finding this at one point later on, where he's explaining on the House floor. He says, Mr. Speaker, I mentioned I saw him on C-SPAN. Mr. Speaker, I have here in my hands reporting from the British press today about how the Bush administration was selling chemical weapons to Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, right leading up to the invasion of Kuwait. So it kind of raises the question of like, what right do we have to intervene in these countries to right all the wrongs that we helped them perpetrate in the first place? And Mr. Speaker, it's just unwise, and we ought to not have a foreign policy like this kind of thing. You know how Ron Paul does. Mm-hmm. And then at the bottom of the screen, it says, Ron Paul, R, Texas. And I'm like, no way. Because like, I don't know where you're from, but George H.W. Bush, everyone knows, like, is from Kennebunkport, Maine, and from Connecticut and all of this stuff. But he made his fortune in West Texas as an oil man and was very closely, tied to Houston power brokers and Texas politics for a very long time. And at that time, his son was the governor of the state. And clearly, by a million miles, the leader of the Republican Party of the state of Texas. And here's a congressman from Galveston accusing his father, the former president, of treason. Essentially, certainly to my ears, right? And then the point just being that Ron Paul has the courage to speak the truth. He don't give a damn at all about, what, I'm in trouble or something. I don't care about in trouble. Here's another one for you. Yeah, Oklahoma City. Well, my constituents are a lot more worried about getting blown up by the federal government, like what happened at Waco. And man, they went crazy when he said that. He said that on Washington Journal, I think also in 1997. He said that on Washington Journal on C-SPAN in the morning. And man, they went nuts, blown up like the people of Waco. Which, yeah, by the way, that is what happened. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, so this is, the origins of my undying loyalty to Dr. Paul. And he was wise enough to cultivate a real constituency among libertarians and among Bircher types who are more like, to the right, but also too conspiracists to like a Bush, right? Those are the kinds of people who really loved Ron Paul. And I sort of straddle both worlds where I always was really much more of a libertarian in spirit, and yet more of a conspiracy kook of a Bircher in my politics or in my, analysis. However, then, and that included predicting 9/11, as a lot of people did. I'm not saying exclusively, but like I knew for a very long time. We used to always joke about, man, all those people who rode in my cab who must have said, oh my God, it's just like he said was going to happen, kind of thing. But I'm lucky that I was not on the radio at the time. I had a radio show before that on Free Radio Austin, and I had a show very soon after that, or pretty soon after that, on Radio Chaos. Just right at the time of September 11th, I didn't have a show. So I was not in any kind of hurry to like make all of my declarative pronouncements about everything in front of some audience I had to please or anything like that. It's just me and my friends and, you know, people in my cab and whoever, my regular customers and whoever I'm talking to about this stuff. And, you know, basically I already did know a lot about covert support for the Bin Ladenite movements in the world and stuff like this. But I decided I wanted to just hold my horses and not get too carried away, just being whatever, you know, part of or to whatever degree some attempted leader of the truther movement or whatever. I just wasn't part of that. And I watched as the truthers and the neoconservatives did the exact same thing at the exact same time, which was cherry pick the case for what they wanted to say, which was Dick Cheney did it or Saddam Hussein did it, depending on the group, and how they just cherry picked whatever they want and ignored everything else. They never say, well, no, this is true, but still, though, however, on the other hand, something else, though, that I think still negates that, though. Or no, they never are fair. They never speak like an honest person that way. It's always just a bunch of claims. And then when you call them out, they go, well, what about this? And what about this? And it's like you had the truther movement and you had the neoconservatives doing the exact same thing at the exact same time, right before my eyes, in what to me amounted to like super slow motion for a year and a half. After September 11th, before they could launch their damned war, right? It took until March of 2003 to get the thing actually in gear. And so that to me was just like the slowest motion train wreck, the slowest motion pile of propaganda being loaded up by these people to lie us into that war. And at that time is when I finally did find the Mises Institute and LouRockwell.com. And I love Lou Rockwell immediately because I could tell that he knew all about the same conspiracy stuff as me, but he only believed in it about a quarter as much as I did. He was like educated on all that literature, but he was not like into it, right? He only would like ratify the true part and but was no fool at all. So he really became a guy to look up to when it came to that. And then there was Justin Raimondo at Antiwar.com. And when I started reading Justin, I just knew immediately that all this, and no offense to the fans out there, but all this G. Edward Griffin stuff from The Creature from Jekyll Island, and for that matter, Will Griggs stuff from The New American of that era, that this is all about building a one world federal government under the United Nations. And it's all through the Freemasons and the Skull and Bones and the Rockefeller institutions is how it all is coming about. That was all just bullshit. That was not at all what was going on. And that Dick Cheney was not a one worlder. They didn't give a damn about building up the UN in New York City or whatever international court systems in Brussels or any of that. And instead, they were going for not full, but some species of right-wing nationalism combined with, you know, in alliance with the Labour Party in England and the Likud in Israel, and the rest of the world be damned. And so I had to admit at that time, I was, you know, grown up enough by 26 or whatever, that like, okay, I'm wrong. And I don't know really what's going on here. But then I started reading Raimondo, and Raimondo did know what was going on here. And it was not like, oh, I need another guru. It was just, no, I found a guy who obviously does know who these guys are and what this is about. Right. So like, I mean, that clearly was what it was. And so I admitted to myself that like that whole G. Edward Griffin grand design thing is wrong. And the new thing has nothing to do with any new world order. It's just the American empire and running errands for the Likud, just as in our same present day. And that was really what was going on. And in fact, I don't know, I guess you must have read Provoked because you've referenced it in some of your other work. That I think you might even be able to tell now after hearing me explain this, how my treatment of the Bush senior years and the Bill Clinton years in that book, in a way, is my adjusting from how wrong I was then and explaining what was really going on. So the whole time that I thought that Bill Clinton was trying to bring Russia slowly but surely into NATO to create one world white army of the North to serve the UN as its, you know, army ultimately to confront China and Islamic South Asia, that That just wasn't true. I was just wrong about that. They created the NATO-Russia Council as a sop to Russia. This is all you get, scumbag, which was just totally the opposite of what I thought was going on at the time. So I definitely have it right in Provoked now, but I wrote Provoked in the late 40s. So that's why I knew what I was talking about by then. So there's a bit of that in there. But anyway, so then, and then that's basically it, right? So then by the time of the start of the Iraq War, I was done being a conspiracy nut. I had found, the paleo libertarian anti-war set in antiwar.com and the Mises Institute, and found where I fit in there basically. And that's the work I've been doing since then.